Welcome, everyone. We're just going to give it a couple minutes. We will start exactly at 1:45. We're going to let everybody come into the room. So welcome. As you come into the room, you can offer into the chat box where you're coming to us from. And if you want to include the agency that you work for or your affiliation, that would be great. We'd love to hear who's in the room. Again, if you're just entering our room, we are going to start in a few minutes. We would love for you to put in the chat box where you're coming to us from and maybe the affiliation, your agency or your school. That would be great. So we have an idea of who our audience is. Very helpful for us. So we welcome you to use the chat box to enter that information. So it is 1:45. We are going to start. Next slide, please. So welcome to our School Mental Health Summit, Emerging Stronger and More Resilient, Learning from the COVID-19 Crisis. This is day 2 of our virtual conference and our final session. So we are so happy that you joined us. The 2021 Northeast and Caribbean MHTTC School Mental Health Summit brings together leaders, practitioners, researchers, and other stakeholders in the school mental health field to share the latest research and best practices. The conference has emphasized a shared school, family, community agenda to bring high quality and evidence-based mental health promotion, prevention, and intervention to students and families as part of a multi-tiered system of supports. This conference is sponsored by the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, or MHTTC, housed at Rutgers School of Health Professions, Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions. My name is PJ Wanger, and I am the Senior Training and Consultation Specialist of this center, and I will be hosting this conference session today along with our presenter. Next slide. This is session day 2, session 4, helping my grieving student when COVID loss comes into the school. Next slide. The MHTTC is funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to enhance the capacity of the behavioral health and other related workforces to deliver evidence-based and empirically supported practices to individuals with mental illnesses. We have also been awarded additional supplemental funding focused on enhancing school mental health in schools. Please visit the MHTTC Network website for additional information, and we will put that website in the chat. Next slide, please. Funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, the MHTTC network includes 2 regional centers, a National American Indian and Alaska Native Center, a National Hispanic and Latino Center, and a network coordinating office. Our center is Region 2, serving New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the United States Virgin Islands. Next slide, please. Supplemental funding was awarded to provide training and technical assistance to teachers and school staff regarding student mental health. The objectives of these activities is to communicate the importance of mental health supports in schools, enhance the capacity to recognize and identify mental health concerns in students, and to educate staff on the best models of school-based mental health services and when to link to community-based services. Next slide, please. We have the capacity and expertise to provide national webinars, general trainings, professional development meetings, and extensive technical assistance and consultation services on school mental health topics that are listed on this slide. Next slide, please. If you're interested in staying up to date with the events and products the Northeast and Caribbean MHTTC is providing, please sign up to receive our email communications. You can sign up at the bit.ly link provided on the screen, and it also will be shared in the chat box. Next slide, please. Following the webinar, you will be asked to complete a brief survey. We value this feedback and use it to improve our activities and inform future activities. The surveys are also important because our continued funding is linked to the completion of these surveys. So we thank you in advance for your feedback. Next slide, please. We also want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our conference website, along with the PowerPoint slides within a week of the conclusion of this conference. Next slide, please. The opinions expressed herein are the views of the speakers and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. No official support or endorsement of the Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA for the opinions described in this presentation is intended or inferred. Next slide, please. We encourage you to interact with our presenter today during the webinar by using the chat feature. Please post any comments or questions you have in the chat, and I will collect your questions as we go and ask them of the presenter during the Q&A time toward the end of the presentation. During the webinar, our presenter may pose questions to you. Please use the chat to answer these questions. Next slide, please. The MHTTC uses affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in all our activities. This includes language that is strength-based and hopeful, language that is inclusive and accepting of diverse cultures, genders, perspectives, and experiences, language that is healing-centered and trauma-responsive, language that invites individuals to participate in their own recovery journey, language that is person-first and free of labels, language that is non-judgmental and avoids assumptions, language that is respectful, clear, and understandable, and consistent with our actions, policies, and products. Now let's begin our session. Next slide, please. We have Dr. David Schoenfeld with us today. Dr. David Schoenfeld is a developmental behavior pediatrician in general pediatrics at Children's Hospital, Los Angeles, and director of the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. He holds a joint appointment at the Keck School of Medicine of USC. Dr. Schoenfeld has authored more than 100 scholarly articles, book chapters, and books, and has given more than 800 presentations on the topics of pediatric bereavement and crisis. He has provided consultation and training on school crisis and pediatric bereavement in the aftermath of a number of school crisis events and disasters within the United States and abroad, including school and community shootings in Newtown, Connecticut, Marysville, Washington, Aurora, Colorado, Chardon, Ohio, and Townville, South Carolina, flooding from hurricanes, Sandy in New York and New Jersey, and many others. He has also conducted school-based research involving children's understanding of and adjustment to serious illness and death, as well as school-based interventions to promote adjustment and risk prevention. Now I'm going to turn it over to our presenter, Dr. Schoenfeld. It's all you.
Thank you very much, PJ. And so, as mentioned, I'm going to be talking about helping my grieving students when COVID-19 loss comes into the school. So this pandemic has caused widespread distress among children and adults, but not all of this distress represents trauma symptoms or trauma disorders. The challenges, in my opinion, facing most children probably relate more to loss than to trauma itself. Our society has grown of late to appreciate the important impact of trauma on children, resulting in a call to become trauma-informed. But we have, as a country, been much slower to recognize we must also become grief-sensitive. I remember going and talking with a teenager. He had been in a community-based shooting, a mass shooting, and the person on either side of him was shot and killed, but he was actually not injured in the shooting. And he had chosen not to go in for counseling, and he had come back to school once and only stayed for about an hour or two and then left. And so it was about 3 weeks after the shooting when I was in town, and I went and visited him at his home. And I asked him why I wasn't getting counseling, and he said that he didn't really think it was relevant. He had experienced some trauma symptoms, but he said they all resolved within a week. He'd been jittery, had trouble sleeping, was on edge, had trouble concentrating, but he said that was all better. So then I asked him, well, why aren't you in school? And he said, well, I did go to school once, but it didn't feel right. And I said, why didn't it feel right? And he said, it didn't feel right being there without her. Well, one of the people that was shot and killed that was right next to him was his girlfriend, who he planned on marrying. And he said to be in school without her just didn't feel right. So I looked at him and I said, well, maybe you're grieving the death of your girlfriend. And he seemed surprised and he said, you know what, that's it. And if somebody's willing to talk to me about that, then I'll go for counseling now. But I just don't want to keep talking about the shooter anymore. So I think what happens is we sometimes focus on the trauma. And in this particular case, the trauma he had experienced was quite significant, but the loss was actually what was more impactful to him. And the interventions and supports that we offer to children and adults who are grieving are actually quite different from trauma treatments. At a very basic level, when you're addressing trauma, you're focusing on the person's reaction to something that happened. But support for grief focuses instead on helping people cope with loss, the persistent absence of a person, rather than the way the person died. I served on the Sandy Hook Advisory Commission, and one of the parents came to testify to the group, and she said, after the end of the school year, she got a yearbook that her child, who was still attending Sandy Hook, brought home. She said she opened it up and she found that the picture of her child who died in Sandy Hook had been removed. And she said all the pictures of everyone who died that day, students and staff, had been removed as if they had never existed. And she just looked at us and she said, I don't know why anyone would ever do that. But I will tell you that I've been in other schools where they have consciously excluded the photographs of individuals who have died during the school year because they don't want them to be trauma triggers, but they don't recognize that it's really part of the healing process for grief. And so what we do is different for grief than what we do for trauma. And what I'm finding in many communities right now is people are just starting to understand that what they're experiencing, there has been some trauma. I'm not trying to minimize that, but in many ways, this pandemic is characterized by loss. And so that's what we're going to talk about. Now, even outside the context of a pandemic, bereavement is common in the lives of children. About 5% of US children experience the death of a parent, and about 90% experience the death of a close family member or friend. Now, most children do adjust even to a major loss in their life, but bereavement has a significant and often long-term impact on learning, social and emotional development, behavior, and adjustment. So what I'd like to do is begin by talking about how do we support grieving students in general, outside the context of a crisis. And then I'll talk about the unique challenges to supporting grieving students during the pandemic and offer some free resources for addressing these unique challenges. I'm also going to ask you to please put questions into the chat because I've left plenty of time at the end to discuss some of those questions, and it's helpful if you just include them as we're going. Now, schools can and ought to provide a supportive environment to grieving students, but that doesn't require the classroom educators provide bereavement counseling, but rather that they provide an empathic and supportive presence. I often like to show a video clip of an interview that I did with a teacher, and she talked about the fact that one of her students had returned to school after being out for a week because his mother was in the hospital. And when he got back to class, this was prior to the pandemic, he told the teacher that his mother had died during that hospitalization. She was very taken back by that. She wasn't aware that she hadn't gotten any of that information beforehand. And she said she gave a hug to him, hugged him. This was prior to the pandemic when you could do that. And she said, I just looked at him and I said, I can't even imagine what it's like to lose your mother. I'm here for you. Do you want to talk about it? And apparently he just got embarrassed. I think he was middle school age. And he just said, please don't do this. So she said, okay, we don't have to talk about it now. And she said, but my door is always open. So please come and talk with me when you're ready. And you can talk with anyone in the school. Our doors are all open. But he didn't come back to talk with her. But he did come after school several weeks later just to say thank you. And when she asked why, he said, you were here and I didn't have to talk about it. And she said, I realized then that sometimes kids don't want to talk about it. She gave really an excellent metaphor. She said, it's kind of like a dance. I take the first step of the dance. If the student's ready, then we continue the dance. If not, that's okay. We can just stop and listen to the music together. And I think that's what we're really asking classroom folks to do, and community-based providers as well, is just to listen to the music together with kids who are grieving. And that often goes a long way. So the first step is to do what that teacher did, which is acknowledge the loss. There's a common myth that somehow talking to children about their loss is going to upset them. But when you ask kids or adults how they're feeling after the death of someone close to them, the upset that you see is not because of the question. You've merely invited them to share how they're already feeling. They're grieving because of the loss. But many children may not even notify the school when the child has experienced a death. And many children and adolescents may not appear to be grieving when you see them in the classroom setting. And there are many reasons for that. One is that adults may unwittingly communicate to children, even from a very young age, that death is just not something you openly discuss. If you imagine a young child is told by a parent that the other parent has died, the child may then just turn to the surviving parent and say, well, I know that daddy's dead, but does that mean he's not going to be here for my birthday next week? And at that point, the surviving parent often just cries. And the egocentrism of children are going to lead them to conclude somehow that they caused the parent to cry by misbehaving. And many children may actually turn around and just try and reassure their parent and say things like, it's okay, mom. I can do everything that dad used to do. I can help make dinner. I can take out the trash. We're going to be okay. And that often gives the illusion to parents that the kid's actually either not grieving or has somehow already adjusted to it. But in fact, they may just be waiting to grieve until they're able to first take care of the adults around them who are grieving. And this isn't just young children. I remember meeting with one adolescent. His brother had died in an accident, and his mother worked at the hospital that I was at the time. She was a nurse, and she had taken off about 2 months after the death occurred. This child's brother had gone swimming with a group of friends and just dove into the water and never came up, and they never knew why that happened. And so it was a very kind of tragic and unsettling loss. So after she came back to work, it was maybe like 3 or 4 weeks later, she came to speak with me and asked if I could talk with her other son. And she said, you know, he was doing fine for about 2 months, and now he's just not doing well. So the boy came in with his mother, and I asked him what was going on, and he confirmed what his mother said. He said, you know, I was doing okay for about 2 months, but now I can't concentrate. I can't do my work. I'm feeling sad a lot of the time. I'm having trouble sleeping. And I asked, why do you think you were doing okay for 2 months? And he said, I have no idea. And I looked at him because, I mean, it's pretty clear to me what was happening. So I just said, sometimes it's hard to see your mother grieving. And he looked at me and he said, if I had one more night where she cried herself to sleep on my shoulder, I was just going to lose it. So he literally couldn't start grieving. He had to take care of his mother first. And, you know, the mother's husband, dad, was in the household too, and I'm sure would have been a support to his wife. But this adolescent was a particularly empathic young man, and I could understand why people would turn to him for support. But that may mean he can't really then grieve himself the way he needs to. Now, there are many other reasons why children may not appear to be grieving. It's not just that they're supporting adults. Very young children may not yet understand what's happened, or at least not understand all of the implications of the loss. When somebody dies, you lose the person, and that's what we call in the field the primary loss. But you also lose everything that person did for you, might have done for you, or could have done for you in the future. And those are all the secondary losses. Adults tend to think of those secondary losses pretty quickly, whereas the children don't. They grow into it. I remember one dad telling me after his wife died in an accident that he lived in dread of the day his daughter had her first period. But his daughter was 5 years old at the time, and I assure you that was not on her mind. It will be when she gets older and she approaches that age or reaches that point in her life, and I'm sure she will acutely miss her mother at that point. But at 5, she's not thinking that far in advance about that aspect. So sometimes children don't understand the full magnitude, even when they understand what has occurred. But they may actually understand what it means for them and their family, but then just feel so overwhelmed by their feelings that they don't want to talk about it in school. Even if they go and meet with a school mental health professional or an educator who takes the child aside, they may realize that they have to leave that conversation and go back into the classroom and do math. And they may not think that they can make that transition, and so they may just avoid thinking about or discussing their grief. But they may also express their grief indirectly through their behavior or through their play. And we know there are a wide range of games that all children play that have death as a central theme. So one of the first games that children play, it's actually in every culture around the world, in the first year of life, the same developmental period, is what we call in the United States peekaboo. What it seems to happen is children, when they're born, don't have object permanence. So for a 2 or 3 month old, when someone leaves the room, out of sight is literally out of mind. So they don't seem to maintain the same internal mental representation of important people in their lives when they're very young infants. And as a result, they can't really grieve the person, because otherwise they'd have to grieve every time they moved out of sight. But children in the second half of the first year of life, around 6 to 9 months of age on average, will start to develop object permanence. And at that point, they're able to grieve permanent loss. And at that point, at that same developmental period, children start to play peekaboo. And in that game, what happens is the child fixes their gaze on someone. There's separation as if the person has died. There's heightened concern and awareness, and then joy at reunion. And kids need to play that over and over again. And so you have to ask yourself, if children everywhere in the world play the same game at the same developmental period and play it frequently, you have to ask yourself why. And people have said because they're trying to deal with death and grief. And actually, peekaboo, if you translate it literally from Old English, peekaboo is alive or dead. And that's what the game is about. So I go through this because a lot of times adults will tell me, this child is too young to talk about death, but they've been talking about death since the first year of life. It's just the adults don't know that's what the conversation is about all the time. But that doesn't mean that the kids don't understand that. Now, children may understand it. They may be ready to talk about it, but they may still choose to keep their losses as private. I know we often talk about as communities and countries and the world grieve together. But quite honestly, grief is a personal experience. We can mourn together and we can support each other with our shared experiences of loss. But grief is a personal experience. And sometimes children don't really want to share that. I did a lot of work with New York City schools after 9/11. And we found that there were some families where the children and the parents decided consciously that they were not going to share with the school that a parent or other family member had died in the World Trade Center attack, because the kids said they didn't want to be one of the 9/11 kids. And I think that's going to be happening during this pandemic, where kids may not want to be one of the COVID kids. They may not want to get questions about what that experience was like. There's probably some stigma associated with it as well. And of course, if it's a recent loss, there may be concerns about contagion as well. But for many reasons, kids may just not want to be singled out in that way. So there are many reasons why kids don't talk about this. And you have to add to that many adults don't like to talk about it either. Adults may think they don't know what to say to make things better or to make it at least all better. And they're often afraid that they're just going to say the wrong thing and somehow unnecessarily upset children or make them feel worse. So I find it helpful to review some well-intentioned comments that may actually not be the best to share with someone who's grieving. And I should say this is all in the context of if you're a school employee or if you're a mental health provider and you're supporting a child who's under your care. It's like I'm referring to when it is a situation where this is part of your professional role. It's very different if you're talking about how you would communicate with your own child, where you have a shared experience of loss. But this is where it's really all about the child and the child's loss. So the first thing is, don't try and cheer up grieving children by making statements such as, I know it hurts very much right now, but I know you're going to feel better within a short period of time. Instead, allow them their grief for the period of time that it takes for them. Anything that begins with at least is probably something you should reconsider. At least he's not in pain anymore. At least he's in a better place. At least you still have a brother. All of those comments are really attempts on the part of the person who is the witness of the grief to try and decrease the expression of grief by the grieving individual solely so that the witness feels more comfortable. But it doesn't help the person that's grieving. You also don't want to encourage them in other ways to be strong or to cover up their emotions. You should feel free to express your own feelings and demonstrate empathy, but I wouldn't state you know exactly how someone else feels. Comments such as, I realize this must be extremely difficult for you, or I can only imagine what this is like for you and your family, are fine ways to start the conversation. But I think you need to allow the child to then direct what they wish to talk about. I would avoid statements such as, I know exactly what you're going through, even if you had a similar type of loss, your experience is going to be different than the child's experience. And it's really not about how you felt, it's really about how the child is feeling. I also wouldn't say things like, you must be angry. You don't want to tell people how they ought to feel. Instead, what you want them to do is to communicate how they're feeling and just give them the opportunity to express that. I would, in general, limit the sharing of your own personal loss experiences. Keep the focus instead on the grieving child and the grieving child's personal experience. You also want to allow the child to be upset while suspending judgment. And I would intervene only when safety and health is a concern, such as if there's suicidal or homicidal ideation. If a child voices some statement that makes you concerned that they are hurting themselves or at risk of harming themselves seriously, that is an emergency. You should be getting a mental health professional involved immediately and not just discredit it because the child is grieving. But otherwise, if they're not really harming themselves or giving you the impression that they are going to hurt themselves or someone else in a significant way, then it's best to just allow them to grieve the way that they feel like grieving and try not to judge, is this normal or abnormal? Now, some children and adults are also worried that they're going to say or do the wrong thing because they somehow feel ill-informed about another person's culture. And although there are differences in cultural practices, the fundamental experience of grief is universal. When we recognize there's a range of ways to experience and express grief, we can then explore ways to bridge cultural differences in order to help grieving children and families of very different backgrounds. But ask questions when you're unsure what would be most helpful for a family or an individual. The reality, though, is that assumptions may result in stereotypes that cloud our perceptions and make us miss opportunities to be helpful. I had the opportunity to support an Amish family after the sudden death of one of their children. And I was visiting the family after providing some support remotely. And the grandmother was walking me around her house. They had showed me, their place of business, other family members' homes, the community, the Amish schoolhouse. They were taking me around and really helping me understand their perspective because I invited them to do so. And at one point when we were in the house, the grandmother pointed to a photograph and she said, "This is a picture of my grandchild who was killed." And at that point, she explained that one day the grandchildren were visiting and they were outside playing, and she went to check on them. And when she went outside to check on them, there was a tourist who was from out of state, who was a photographer, and was taking pictures of the children. And she said, I looked at him and I said, "Sir, please don't take photographs. This violates our religious and cultural beliefs. We consider them to be graven images. We're uncomfortable by being photographed. And I would ask that you respect our culture and our religion by not photographing the children." But apparently her granddaughter, who was about 5 at the time, was so excited because she had never had her picture taken before. And she begged her grandmother. She just said, "Grandma, please, he's a photographer. He's going to send us a copy. I don't have a picture. Could you please let him take a picture?" And she looked at me and she said, "I was just so embarrassed and uncomfortable that I just let it happen." And then she pointed to the picture and she said, "What a gift from God. Because if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't have this picture to remember her." I use that example because I knew something, I had some background about the Amish community. I was from I had worked in that area and been to the community multiple times before. And I knew that they don't like to be photographed. So I would never have recommended to an Amish family that they use a photograph as a transitional object or a way to help them grieve or remember the person that lost, because it's in violation of their cultural and religious beliefs in general. But if I had conveyed that or presumed that for this individual, then how would she ever have been able to tell me that that was exactly what she was doing? So the point is, yes, you can become educated, but you really should approach the family with an open mind and an open heart. Help families identify and communicate what's important to them about their cultural practices and beliefs, and then work with them to find solutions and compromises if realities require modifications in their cultural practices. For example, during this pandemic, it wasn't safe at one point to have family members clean or prepare the body for funeral, or to hold large funeral ceremonies, or early on in the pandemic, even to sit Shiva in person or visit grieving families in the neighborhood to bring over food. What we've been seeing instead was the use of virtual services, even virtual Shiva, and coordination of meal delivery through online services. There was an app. There's always an app, but there was an app that could be used so that families could put in, grieving families could put in their food preferences and restaurants they liked in the area, and other people could enter their credit card information and donate money towards food delivery for that purpose. It is not, of course, the same thing as bringing the food over, but it is an approximation. And so I think what we need to do is find out, what do families want and need, and then figure out how to come as close as possible to fulfilling what the goal is of that need. Now, I've reviewed why you should say something, and I went over what not to say. So let me go over what you can do to get conversations started. So the first thing is express concern. Let students know you've heard about their loss and you're available to listen and offer support. Be genuine in your communications. Children can tell when adults are authentic in their communications. And so I wouldn't tell a child that you miss their uncle too if you've actually never met him. You can, though, tell the child that you're sad that she's experienced the loss of someone close to her, and that would be genuine and authentic. You can then invite conversation. You can just use simple, direct, open-ended questions such as, how are you and your family doing? And then listen and observe. You want to listen more and talk less. Share your observations as you wish about students' behavior or responses, but do that in a non-judgmental manner, such as, you're not contributing enough in class, would be judgmental. But saying, since your mother died, I've noticed you're quieter in class. Can I ask how you're doing? Is an observation that's shared, but in a non-judgmental manner. As I already mentioned, you want to limit your personal sharing. Please draw on your personal experiences to help you better understand students, but don't presume that they are the same or had the same experience as you did. And you don't need to share your experience with them. Instead, keep the focus on the student and their loss. You can offer practical advice. For example, discuss ways to respond to questions from peers or classmates. If kids may be uncomfortable when they come back to class and worry that students are going to ask them repetitive or probing questions, and you can help them think about, well, what will you say if they ask what happened to your mother? Educators can talk with peers and help them learn how to become more comfortable supporting a grieving friend. Most children want to help their friends, but just like adults, they often feel uncomfortable with that role, and they have even more limited experience in supporting someone who's grieving. They may therefore ask insensitive comments or questions, ask repetitive or detailed questions about the death, or sometimes they even tease the grieving peer. In one study of children 6 to 15 years of age who experienced the death of a parent, 20%, or 1 out of 5, reported that they had experienced direct, raw taunting about their loss. Peers may also just distance themselves from the grieving child in order to cope with their own anxieties or discomfort. Educators can instead help students develop the skills to support a peer who's grieving by correcting misinformation and misunderstandings, helping them understand in another context how death might affect them and their family, and help students understand what they can do to be supportive to their peer. Going back to the list of steps, the next one is to offer reassurance. Without minimizing their concerns, let students know that over time, they'll be better able to cope with their distress. Most important, emphasize you're going to be there during that time period. And then maintain contact. At first, children may not accept your invitation to talk or your offers of support, but their questions will evolve over time. So just remain available, concerned, and connected, and wait until they're ready to accept your invitation. Now, when supporting grieving students, it's also helpful to identify, in particular, guilt reactions and attempt to address them. Young children tend to be very egocentric, as I mentioned earlier. They assume they have control over external events through their actions and thoughts, and they may have a limited understanding of the true reasons why people die. And in order to make some sense of a death of someone close to them, children often come up with explanations that rely on what we call magical thinking, and assume there was something they did, didn't do, or should have done that would have prevented the death of someone close to them. And that can result in guilt after a death. But even older children and adults often feel guilty when there's no logical, objective reason for them to feel responsible personally for a death. People may actually assume some responsibility, at least unconsciously, because it may allow them to believe that by taking different actions than they had taken before in the future, they somehow can prevent the death of someone else they care deeply about. So in other words, when a death has occurred, one of the things that individuals worry about is, will others I care about die? And if they can convince themselves that they directly contributed to the death that happened, they can at least reassure themselves around that particular anxiety, that if they do things differently, it won't happen again. But that has problems, obviously. And so what it does is it leaves children feeling responsible for the death, and it isn't logical. So it gives you the illusion of control, but it doesn't actually give you control. So you can change your behaviors, but if they didn't lead to the death in the first place, the change of behavior probably isn't going to prevent future loss. So it's ineffective, and it also leads to guilt. Now, children may experience the death of a family member during this pandemic and question how they inadvertently exposed the family member to the virus, or wonder how they should have picked up on symptoms before the illness became more serious in the person that died, or wondered how they might have gotten better help earlier on in the illness to try and change its course. And so, unfortunately, in order to try and promote compliance with certain recommendations for risk reduction, we've actually used a lot of fear messaging. And we've told kids early on in the pandemic in particular that they were not at risk of serious illness and death. But if they were selfish, particularly with youth, and went out and violated the social distancing rules, they might inadvertently become infected, be asymptomatic, but spread it to someone they love and kill that adult. So I've heard government officials say things like, well, if you go out, think about your grandparent, because you might actually kill them through that action. Well, now when a grandparent does die, kids are going to wonder, what did they do to cause it? And we've already told them they could be asymptomatic and that they won't know. So I think we always see guilt after death occurs, but we're going to see it a lot more during this pandemic. And guilt continues to be an extremely common reaction, even with adolescents and adults. And for that reason, I actually make it a practice to reassure children and adults of their lack of responsibility for death, even when you never thought they had a reason to feel guilty. I remember doing a presentation to an elementary school class. I think there were about third and fourth grade level students. And I just went and did a presentation about what happens when someone dies and how people react and how to support individuals who are grieving. The teacher had the students write letters to me. And I remember one of the letters just said, "Dear Dr. Schoenfeld, thank you for coming to my class and talking about what happens when someone dies. Now I know it's not my fault my father killed himself." And then she just wrote, "Have a happy Valentine's Day," and signed her name. Now, I'm not suggesting that, a 30 or 40-minute presentation to a class of children was enough to help this girl deal with the guilt associated with the death of a parent by suicide. But it actually was enough to get her to at least communicate she had that guilt. And that's one of the first steps to trying to help deal with it. Now, guilt doesn't always go away. Often it does not, even with appropriate reassurance. And so often the best approach in those situations is just to say, you tell me that you feel responsible for your parents' death. There isn't anything you've told me that makes me think that you actually did contribute in any way to the death, but I know that's how you feel. So can I ask you, what do you think it's going to take before you're ready to forgive yourself? And then you try and work with them on getting to that point. So guilt is an important point. I just wanted to make sure I highlighted that. But let me turn now to some practical things that you can do within a classroom setting. So one is academic accommodations. It's common for students to experience at least temporary academic challenges after the death of a family member or a close friend. And quite honestly, you're going to see that in the majority of students just dealing with a major crisis such as the pandemic. Pre-existing learning challenges often become worse and new problems can develop. So it's important to offer academic support proactively. Don't wait for students to begin demonstrating academic challenges. And worst of all, don't wait for academic challenges to become academic failure before you offer that help. Schools can and should be a source of valuable support to grieving or traumatized students. But if academic expectations even temporarily exceed students' capacity to learn, school is more likely to become an additional source of distress. And I really worry, with all of the pressure for students to somehow catch up or to accelerate learning or to remedy learning gaps, that we're going to place demands on children's ability to learn while they're still grieving and dealing with ongoing crisis of the pandemic at a level that they're not going to be able to do, and we're just going to cause more distress. So assist grieving students in identifying the level of academic work that feels both appropriate and achievable at the time. I've listed some helpful modifications to consider. One is change the assignment. So for example, you might allow a student to work on a project with a partner rather than do it by themselves if they find it hard to concentrate or sustain their attention when they're doing it by themselves. But actually, some students find it hard to collaborate and socialize when they're grieving, and they may actually want to turn a group project into an individual assignment. You might find someone wants to take a formal research paper and instead turn it into something more engaging, like an oral report or an art project or a video. But if a grieving student is feeling self-conscious or awkward, then the last thing they might want is to be in front of a camera or to speak in front of a group. So what I'm trying to highlight is it's not that there's a particular way that grieving children need their assignments to be, but rather that we should accommodate what fits best for them at that point in time. You may also want to change the focus or timing of a lesson. A literature class might choose a different book to discuss if the originally scheduled one describes a death similar to the one a student is currently grieving. So a health class, for example, on the dangers of substance abuse might be postponed, or at least the grieving student excused if they just lost a sibling or parent to a drug overdose. You can also reschedule or adapt tests. Immediately after a death, students might be exempted from some testing, or at least given modifications, such as testing alone in a quiet location and with extra time. The scores might be balanced differently, so you might omit or weight the scores or grades that were achieved soon after the death occurred. You can consider 504 plans, or if the student has an IEP, modifications. It's important for teachers to try and find that balance between maintaining reasonable expectations so they make academic growth and are prepared to go on to the next year. But you have to balance that against the type of, if they need additional support and accommodations in order to achieve with the current lessons. Let me turn now to another area, which is grief triggers that may occur in the classroom setting. Grief triggers are sudden reminders of someone that died that can cause temporary but still powerful emotional responses in children who are grieving. These grief triggers can be anything that reminds children of the individual that died. So it might be a song that their mother used to sing, a country they visited on vacation with their cousin. It just comes up in social studies. Or there might be a poem in class that just talks in passing about the friendship among siblings that reminds someone that their sibling has died. Or it can simply be a reminder on the part of the teacher for students to have their parents sign a permission slip for a field trip, and that may remind them about the death of their parent. These are hard to predict, and they often catch children off guard. I remember talking to one teenager. She was talking about the fact that she was in biology class and they were doing a unit on blood vessels. And the teacher asked if anyone could describe what an aneurysm was. So she raised her hand and explained what an aneurysm was. And then the teacher asked, well, what can happen if you have an aneurysm? And she said, well, if it's in an important organ like the brain and the blood vessel leaks, the aneurysm leaks, then the person could die from it. And she looked at me and she said, you know, it's kind of ironic. My teacher can ask a question that means really nothing to her and not recognize what a profound effect it has on the student. And she said, you know, the teacher doesn't know my father died of a ruptured brain aneurysm, but it was a really hard follow-up question for me. And then I asked her, well, you know, has that ever happened another time? And she said, oh, actually, it just happened today. It was the end of, I was talking to one of my best friends after class, and we were joking about how hard a test was. And I said, you know, I'm going to have a heart attack. And my friend just said, yeah, I'm going to have a ruptured aneurysm. She said she started shaking things. And she looked at me and she goes, you know, this is one of my best friends. She's really a lovely person, but I met her after my father died. She doesn't know how my dad died. It's not her fault. So these can come up pretty much anytime. And that's part of what makes them so unsettling. So teachers.
David, I'm going to interrupt because you asked me to interrupt if there was a question that was appropriate. But we have a attendee asking if you have a page that outlines these triggers.
We do. I'm going to go over some of the resources. We actually have video-based modules, and there is one on grief triggers and goes over some of the steps that I'm going to talk about. So almost anything can be a trigger. So, and I'll talk about, there are some you can anticipate, and we do have, and I'll show you the resource for finding that. But quite honestly, it can be almost anything. You know, one I have found just interesting, I don't think most people think about it, is for some reason, when you have credit cards, they often ask the security question, is your mother's maiden name? Well, so that means when you lose your credit card, the first question you're going to be asked is, what was your mother's maiden name? And if your mother's already died, that can be a grief trigger for people. So it's like, now I've lost my wallet and I would normally talk to my mother, but she's dead. And they just reminded me of that. So it can be almost anything. You'll find a parent, for example, might go in a grocery store 2 months after a child has died and be at the checkout line and realize that she bought cookies that her child who died used to have, just reflexively. And as she puts it down on the conveyor belt, realize that she did that and start sobbing on the checkout line. So it can be really anything. And so I think what you do is you tell kids it can be anything. It can happen at any point, and that it's okay, and work out a safety plan. So it's really, you can't prevent all of them, but you can help kids know what to do with it so they don't feel overwhelmed and don't feel like they're going to start crying in class, for example. So let me go over some of those responses. So that might be a safe space or location where the student can go, such as they can go to the social worker or counselor's room, or just go to the library or across the hall. Depends on the age of the child and what's permitted. Or it may be someone that an adult that the child can talk to when they're feeling upset. And you should set procedures for the students to obtain the support discreetly, because you don't want them to have to raise their hand and say, I feel like I'm going to start crying, I'm having a grief trigger, because part of what's so upsetting about it is you feel out of control and embarrassed. So you certainly don't want to draw attention to it. So I know one teacher worked out, this was before the pandemic, that the student would just go and take a tissue from the box near the door and walk out the door. And they worked out, that's a grief, that means he's having a grief trigger, and I know where he's going and when he'll come back. I recognize the fact that during the pandemic, you may not want students going to different places without an appointment, or leaving the classroom because of infection control reasons. So there was one teacher who worked out, this was prior to the pandemic, that the student's father had died and she wore a hoodie to class, and she was a high school student. And whenever she was feeling particularly upset, she just put the hood up. And they joked, they called it a hoodie moment. And when she was having a hoodie moment, the teacher wouldn't call on her. But when she was ready to engage more in the classroom discussion, she put the hood down. And the teacher looked at me and said, I can let her tell me where she's at, and I'll respect those limitations. And said, it's much better than her just being home grieving by herself. At least she's getting something out of class, and she's getting support from others. And I've done this for people who are still doing some virtual lessons. You can even do this on virtual lessons. You can ask the student to keep their webcam off if they're acutely grieving, and that way they can step away from the camera if they're feeling upset. I've actually had several graduate students who have experienced deaths the day I was teaching a virtual course on how to support grieving students. And this is what we worked out. They just didn't have their camera on, and they participated to the level they wanted. Now, of course, I told the students, you don't need to participate. It will be taped. I'll send you it afterwards. But actually, in each case, the students said, no, this is relevant for me now. I want, my mother was usually a friend or a grandparent that was in the hospital and likely to die within 24 hours. But they said, I want to know more about how to support grieving individuals because I have now one of them. And so I think you can work out with kids how you can honor their space and provide support. But you can also work with children and families to anticipate and minimize likely grief triggers. So for example, if you're going to do a Father's Day activity, then you probably should announce to the class something like, we're going to be writing poems for Father's Day. Some of you may not have a father who's alive or currently living with you. You can focus on your memories of your dad, or you can just choose to focus on another important man in your life who supported you. That way we can all do the exercise. That's going to be helpful for kids, not only whose parent died, but also if they have a parent who's absent, whether they're deployed, incarcerated, or just no longer living near the family, or absent in some other way. There may also be children who never knew their father, Father might have died before the child was born, or the child might be a product of artificial insemination. You can't, I don't know how a child would do this activity. If they were a product of artificial insemination, they're not going to raise their hand and ask how to honor a sperm donor. And so they may just not know their dad. And I think for all of those reasons, it's not just around grief from death, which is bereavement, but also it can be for individuals who are missing or don't have their dad present at that time. What you're communicating is we respect the fact that families are different and everyone's background and experience is different, and we will honor where you are at. But you can also seek input from the grieving child and their families about what else might be a personal grief trigger, such as birthdays of the deceased, anniversaries of the death, or activities or events that the child somehow associates with the person that died. For example, if the child used to participate in the science fair and their mother was a scientist, and it was a very special event each year where mom would come and talk about her pride and how the child was doing in science, the next science fair is going to be a little bit more difficult. And if the teacher knows that, the teacher could say something like, oh, I hear that you really are strong in science and you do some of the best science projects. I'm going to come look for you at the science fair because I want to see what you did. Can you let me know where you're going to be? So you provide that type of additional support. It could be the same thing for a kid who's an athlete, who had a parent or sibling who used to cheer for them during the games, who now doesn't really want to play the sport anymore because it just doesn't feel special in the same way. So you can talk with the family and the child and say, what's going to be hard for you? And then we'll do our best to support you. Now, all of these are general considerations about how to support grieving students. But before I kind of open this up just to general questions, what I thought I would do is go over some of the unique challenges of supporting grieving students during this pandemic, and in particular, highlight some of the resources I already alluded to that are from the Coalition to Support Grieving Students that can be used to address these challenges and on how to support grief in general. And then I'm going to introduce the Coalition and its resources and let you know how you can download the guidelines as was asked. Now, after the death of someone close, even outside of a pandemic, children often become more concerned about their health and that of others that they care about. But in the setting of a pandemic, there's so much extreme concern about personal health and that of others that the ability to just reassure children that others close to them are healthy and unlikely to die becomes really difficult. And even if the initial death was completely unrelated to the pandemic or an infectious disease in general. So for example, if a parent died of a car accident and the child is worried someone else will die in the family, and you say, oh, everyone's safe and healthy, don't worry, it gets hard during a pandemic when all you're hearing on the news is counts of all the people that have died. So it becomes important to help children deal not only with their fears and concerns about the pandemic, or I should say, not only do you want to talk about their grief, but you also want to talk about their fears and concerns about the pandemic. And we have a COVID-19 pandemic resources webpage on the Coalition website, as well as the National Center's website, that includes presentations and materials about the pandemic for educators, parents, and other professionals on how to support children. We know that physical distancing measures, including lengthy school closures, have increased the sense of social isolation that's generally experienced by children after death, even outside of a pandemic. And of course, it makes it difficult for schools to provide the support they usually do when they're not in a pandemic. Now, this is certainly true, but it's also true that schools often do provide meaningful support to grieving students when deaths occur during summer vacation and holiday breaks, using phone, email, and other remote means such as the internet. And so we actually talked about how to do that in the Coalition materials, and we even have some guidance on how to do virtual memorials. I talked about secondary losses already, and they become even more of an issue during this pandemic. You may find that families have significant challenges to meeting basic needs, such as paying for rent because of financial impact, or getting food. Some restaurants have closed. But also some grocery stores have closed, particularly in lower income neighborhoods. And the usual outpouring of assistance, support, and companionship that would normally be provided by extended family, friends, neighbors, and members of the school community, at least in the immediate aftermath of the death, may not occur because of concerns about infection outbreak. Family members also may just be overwhelmed by the pandemic and everything that followed the pandemic, in addition to their own grief. So not only might surviving caregivers be forced to deal with their own grief and all of the impact of the pandemic, but they have to care for their grieving children when they're getting less support from friends and family. And the extended family and friends may simply be so preoccupied with everything related to this pandemic and meeting their own needs and that of their family, they may not be reaching out even to provide remote assistance in the same way. We also should recognize that some children's grief may not be related to a loss due to death, as I mentioned. So for some children, they may actually be grieving the separation of, say, family members who live at a large distance and aren't able yet to to visit or to come and celebrate certain occasions. They may grieve their inability to celebrate their graduation, their birthday, or special holidays in the way they used to. We know that transitions from one school to another are always challenging for grieving children, and particularly so when they're going to college. But during the pandemic, to go off to college is really difficult. A lot of times kids feel isolated, and now they're placed in single rooms, told to keep 6 feet apart, wear a mask, and not really socialize at a time when they're feeling really socially isolated and uncomfortable. So this is a very difficult time, I think, for kids going off to college who are grieving. We also have to recognize that supporting students, even in the best of times, is difficult, and this is clearly not the best of times. So this is a really important time, but a hard time to meet professional self-care needs. And so that's part of the focus that we have on the coalition material, is how do you support yourself while you're trying to help grieving students. So I'm just going to end by sharing with you the resources that I mentioned. One is I'd like to introduce you to the Coalition to Support Grieving Students. This is a unique collaboration of the leading professional organizations representing school administrators. It includes the School Superintendents Association, American Federation of School Administrators, and the National Association for Elementary and Secondary School Principals. It also involves classroom educators, both the AFT and the NEA are founding members, and then major organizations for school counselors, ASCA, school nurses, NASN, school psychologists, NASP, and School Social Work Association of America. These groups came together, and you'll see the founding members listed on this slide, along with the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement that I direct, and the New York Life Foundation. But we launched the website probably about 6 or 7 years ago, and since that time, others have asked to join. In fact, more than 100 organizations have already asked and joined the coalition. And this just lists a couple of them, such as the American Academy of Pediatrics, Boys and Girls Club of America, etc. The coalition created a free school practitioner-oriented website, which is just grievingstudents.org, and it houses over 20 video-based training modules, most of which are only 10 to 15 minutes in length. All of them are free of charge and open to the general public. You don't need to register to use the site. You can just click on one of the video modules and watch it on even your mobile phone for 10 minutes or so. The modules are are grouped into 6 sections, each containing 2 to 4 individual video modules. And the topic areas addressed within the 6 sections are listed on this slide. Each of the videos is accompanied by a brief handout, usually about 2 pages in PDF format, that summarizes the major points of the module. So we have some on conversation and support. The first one actually includes actor simulations of talking to a child when they return to school after the death of a parent. But there's also one on what not to say to a grieving child, providing support over time and facilitating peer support. We have a section on developmental and cultural considerations, one on practical considerations such as funeral attendance, secondary cumulative losses, and the role of social media. We have a section on reactions and triggers, so whether that's the impact on learning, guilt and shame, or other reactions. And then we have a section on professional preparation and self-care, and then one on crisis and other special circumstances. So this might be bereavement in the context of a school crisis event, or the unique context of suicide, or how to facilitate commemoration and memorialization in school settings. And we also have one on addressing students and staff that have a potentially life-limiting condition, but that have not yet died. In addition to the video modules and associated print materials, we also have other resources. There are additional modules on, for example, line of duty deaths in the police or the military, guidance documents on dealing that have been developed by the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement on how to respond to the death of a student or staff, whether it's from any cause or particularly from suicide. We have teacher training modules, PowerPoint presentations, and tapes of the presentations that could be used for training purposes. And we have family and staff booklets, as well as articles and online resources. One booklet I'll just point out as an example is called After a Loved One Dies. It can be downloaded in English, Spanish, and it's also available in Japanese, and in the process of having translations done for probably another 7 or so languages, which we hope to be available in the next couple of months. But you can also order free print copies in English and Spanish, and those print copies will be sent free of charge. Even the shipping and handling is covered by the support from the New York Life Foundation. And the last thing I was going to mention is the Grief Sensitive School Initiative. A Grief Sensitive School is an accredited K-12 public or private institution that commits to help provide a supportive environment for students who've experienced the death of a loved one. To be part of this initiative, schools are invited to pledge to foster a more supportive environment for those who are grieving in the school community, provide specific professional learning opportunities on an annual basis, share information with the school community about grievingstudents.org, such as posting information on the school website, increase awareness of the issue of grief at schools, such as informing the parent organization. Actually, the National PTA is now a member organization as well. And you can display a cling and post the logo on the school website and agree to be listed on the coalition website. And then we also ask schools to review relevant school policies and procedures. And just to leave more time for questions, I won't go over these procedures, but they include such things as attendance policies that don't penalize students or staff for absences due to funerals and other mourning rituals, how you communicate with families of deceased students, what you do around commemoration memorialization, mention virtual memorials, what to do related to graduation. Do you acknowledge those that died? Do you grant posthumous degrees to those who have achieved enough credits? What do you do for your yearbook and other end of year activities? And how do you handle requests for on-site funerals, wakes, and related services? The Grief Sensitive Schools Initiative offers presentations to school staff on key bereavement resources. They're facilitated by the New York Life Ambassadors, which are over 1,000 members of the New York Life workforce nationally that have been trained. Schools that receive the presentations and commit to become more grief sensitive following the presentation are also eligible to receive a $500 grant to help enhance their ability to offer grief support and resources. Several thousand schools have already pledged, as have some major school districts, such as, for example, New York City Department of Ed, who've been doing a lot of presentations, particularly during the pandemic, to that school system. And this last slide just provides contact information for the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. So at this point, I'm going to open it up to questions. And I think Stuart or PJ are going to help facilitate the review of that. And I think you also wanted me just to advance to a slide.
Yep, right there. You're good. So we do have a question in the chat box, little lengthy. So grieving and how people view death are diverse. In the Anishinaabe teaching, I hope I said that right, we have a 4-day ceremony for the final journey ceremony. We have had to work with the surrounding schools to help them understand a child's family is not disregarding the importance of their child's education. In reality, they are attending to their loved one's ceremonial needs. What can other educators do to learn about their students' cultural needs to support them?
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point. And as I said, there are many differences. You will also find people may not align exactly with what the traditional cultural belief is for various reasons. But I think you want to ask them and say, what is it that works best for you or your child? Help me understand how we can best support that. I'm actually working with one school now where there was a death of a student, but it was in an active shooter situation where the shooter was Native American. And so, there was a lot of discussion about some of the Native American children their cultural belief and practices, I should say, they were to wait for information from their elders and not to ask questions, but the other students were asking questions. So it becomes, and even just what to do with the space where the shooting happened was complicated, because what some people wanted from one cultural background was different than some of the Native American students, because there was that need for the soul of the individual to transition. And so disruption to that space may have been wanted by some of the staff and students, but not all of them. So I think what you need to do is just ask them to express what their beliefs are and to communicate it, and then say, how are we going to accommodate that? And sometimes it requires a compromise, or it requires doing more than one thing. In some cultures, people feel that if you don't talk about the deceased, it's disrespectful, but in other cultures, it's felt that it's not appropriate to speak about that person. So I think really it's just that you have to ask. I've spoken on this topic really all around the world, and I have found there are differences, but I have also found that the one thing that doesn't differ is that if you show respect and you ask, people are really happy to share with you what their beliefs are. I think it's when you make the presumption. So I often use this example. I mean, this happened this week. I got a message from someone wishing me a Happy New Year. For some reason, they presume I'm Jewish, probably because my last name, I think, is often associated with people of Jewish faith. I'm actually Catholic. I was raised Catholic, and I was an altar boy. And this person has been wishing me a happy Jewish New Year every year for about a decade. Each time I just reply back, thank you. I hope you and your family are also celebrating this time. I don't want to say I'm not Jewish. You don't need to do that. Because I know that that was done as an outreach of someone who wants to make me feel like they share something similar with me, but they're not. And so I think when we make those assumptions, we sometimes actually create distance. But to be quite honest, I have one colleague who keeps talking to me in Yiddish, and I keep saying, I don't know any Yiddish. And he keeps saying, oh, you know this word. And I go, no, I don't know any Yiddish. And so I don't, I haven't yet just said to him, I'm Catholic. Please don't talk to me in Yiddish anymore, because I really don't want to rebuff attempts to be closer. So I think this is a long way of saying that, yes, there are definitely different cultural beliefs, and it is best to ask people what they are for them. But I just wouldn't presume you know what it is based on what you assume is their background, but instead ask them.
Thank you, David. And then just one more question. You had mentioned earlier in the presentation, and I know you had wanted me to interrupt you for pertinent questions, but I missed that one. And they asked, what strategies are good to use for kids who are reluctant to talk about a loss, if you believe that it would benefit them to talk about the loss?
Yeah, so please understand, even if it benefits children to talk about it, it may not benefit them to talk to you. And that may be because of your role. It may be where you're located. It might be because you remind them of someone, or it might be that they're very close to you and they don't want to burden you with the question. There are many different reasons. So what I do try and communicate to kids is, first off, that individuals often find it helpful. That doesn't mean it will be helpful to them. It's just they often do, or generally do. And that you're available and you just check in periodically. I remember reading an article from someone who was interviewing students. These were actually more children of, I think it was males of color in an inner city school system was the actual group that the article focused on. And a lot of these deaths were violence related. And so they asked one of the kids, what was supportive. And he said, I don't remember if it was a teacher or a social worker, came up and asked me if I wanted to talk. And I just said, no, I'm not going to talk to you about it. And then after a while, she just kept asking so many times that I finally realized she actually does care. And then I talked with her, and I'm glad I did. So sometimes it's, I don't want to say persistence, it's just that you remain available and you keep checking back in. But it's also useful to just say, this is really hard for someone for anyone to do by themselves, especially a kid. So who can you talk with? You're always welcome to talk with me, but if you would prefer someone else, who do you have in your life that you can talk to? So you might ask them to figure out whether it's a family member, whether it's someone in a faith-based organization, after-school program, someone in the cafeteria, who is it that you can talk with? So I think for educators and school mental health providers, our goal is to make sure kids get the support they need, but they may choose to access that support in a different location or from a different person. And that is okay. So a lot of times I shift my attention to, I'm here for you, but who else is here for you now that you feel ready to talk to, and shift towards that focus.
Thank you, David. That concludes our questions. If you'll advance to the next slide, please. We thank you for your participation, everyone. The MHTTC network is funded through SAMHSA to provide this training, and as part of receiving that funding, we're required to submit data related to the quality of the spend. So at the end of today's training, please take a moment to complete a brief survey about today's training. You can either use the QR code reader on the screen, or we will share the link to our evaluation in the chat box. I'll just give you a few minutes to read that code. And David, lots of positive feedback in the chat box about how wonderful your presentation was as always, and how the information was great as always. So we really appreciate you being here. If you can advance to the next slide. We'd also want to hear from you about the needs of your schools and your agencies. So we would like your feedback in guiding our educational training and technical assistant efforts by completing our needs assessment. So you can scan the QR code, and also that direct link will also be shared in the chat box. We would like to meet your needs. And so if there are things specifically that you would like trainings or educational or technical assistance on, please include those in that assessment. Next slide, please. And again, we understand that the information presented certainly can be sensitive in nature and can be triggering for many of us who may have suffered a loss. It's been a long 2 days and a lot of information. So here's some resources for you so that we encourage you to take care of yourself and each other. So some links to resources that you may find helpful. And the last slide, David, certainly try to connect with us. We are on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. There's our email and our website. We would like to thank our presenter, David Schoenfeld, for joining us today, and we appreciate your participation. And this does conclude our virtual conference, and we look forward to your participation at our future events. And David, thank you so much for your presentation, and we look forward to continued collaborations with you as well as we bring more information to our colleagues.
Thank you.